They say wars are won by bullets, bombs, and battleships. But sometimes history pivots on something so small, so fragile, so insignificant. Like a woman sitting alone at a typewriter with a ribbon so faded you could barely read the ink camera pushes through a dim, cramped communications room at Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, May 1942. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, fans buzz overhead, paper stacks tremble with each message officer rushing past. Radios hiss with broken Japanese code, and in the middle of that chaos sits Jane Ellsworth, a 24-year-old Navy transcription clerk whose job is simple. Retype incoming signals for the cryptanalysts, except on this night. Nothing is simple. Her typewriter ribbon is torn. One side is dry, the other smudges. Every letter looks faint, ghost-like. She asked supply for a new one 3 times this week, never arrived. Hypo was overloaded, underfunded, and racing against time. With the Battle of the Coral Sea barely over, the Japanese were planning something big, nobody knew where or when. But at 2:17 a.m., a message crackled in. A fragment, a clue, a scrap of intercepted JN25B code that senior analysts dismissed as routine. Just another logistical update. Nothing urgent. Jane didn't think so. Not because she understood the code. She wasn't allowed to see decrypted content, but because of the pattern, the rhythm, the formatting quirks the Japanese clerks often repeated. She saw thousands of these messages. She knew their breathing patterns, the way the Japanese radio men tapped, the spacing errors only humans make. And tonight, something was off. She squinted, hitting each key slowly, carefully. But the torn ribbon made half the characters faint, so she did something no clerk normally did. She typed the same line twice, darker, firmer, pressing until the metal arms snapped sharply on the page. That single decision revealed something nobody in Hypo had noticed. A location indicator, barely visible in the faded ribbon. A 2-character group repeated at odd intervals, a tiny anomaly hidden inside routine traffic. Commander Rochefort, passing behind her, stopped mid-step. "What's that?" he asked. Jane handed him the page. Ink smudged, double-struck, imperfect. Yet clear enough to expose the anomaly. Rochefort's face changed. Color drained. Then came the whisper that would change World War II forever. "Get this to analysis, now. We might have just found AF." AF, the code name for a mysterious Japanese target. And by dawn, Jane's torn ribbon would trigger the confirmation that launched the U.S. into the Battle of Midway. The battle that would sink 4 Japanese carriers in just 5 hours. For the next 6 hours, Hypo didn't blink. The message Jane had retyped, its letters punched twice through a torn ribbon, spread across the analysis tables like wildfire. Men who had spent years trying to break JN25B now hovered around a single smudged page typed by a junior clerk who technically had no role in deciphering anything. But tonight that didn't matter. Commander Rochefort held the sheet up to the lamp, rotating it slowly. The faint characters, barely visible unless light hit them at the perfect angle, lined up into a pattern, a tiny one. But enough. The potential key they had searched for weeks. "Get the grid sheets," Rochefort ordered. Analysts rushed forward. Papers slapped, sliding rulers clicked. One officer spilled coffee across the table and no one even noticed. The room vibrated with urgency. Because if this fragment was what they thought it was, the Japanese strike force had already begun moving. Yet for all the noise, all the brilliance, the room kept circling back to the same question. Why did this message stand out? Why this one? Why now? Why did Jane type it twice? Rochefort walked back to her desk. She sat stiff, nervous, fingers still hovering over the typewriter. "Tell me exactly what made you stop," he asked. Jane swallowed. "Sir, their clerks follow habits. They space in groups of 3, but whenever they mention a location, real or disguised, they change cadence. Tonight the spacing felt wrong." "Felt?" Rochefort repeated. "Yes, sir. Like someone typing while in motion. Maybe on a ship. Maybe close to the target. It didn't match their land station rhythm." Most cryptanalysts would have dismissed her explanation as instinct. But Rochefort knew better. People working with raw code traffic often sense anomalies long before machines or analysts detect them. He nodded slowly. Then almost quietly, "You may have just cracked the door open for us." Across the room, Lieutenant Layton slammed his pencil down. "Sir, the repeated group. This could be an indicator for AF. Same spacing pattern that showed up last month." The room froze. AF, the mysterious target the Japanese were preparing to attack. Some said it might be the Aleutians. Others thought it was Hawaii again. But if Jane's double-struck message hinted at AF, and if AF was what Rochefort suspected, then the Japanese weren't heading north or east. They were heading straight toward Midway. Suddenly everything accelerated. Teletypes clattered. Messengers ran. Maps were unrolled across tabletops. Officers placed flags representing suspected Japanese movements. But there was still doubt upstairs. Washington didn't fully trust Hypo's conclusions. They wanted proof, hard proof, something indisputable, and Rochefort knew they might never get it, unless they exploited the anomaly Jane found. He turned to the team. "We need confirmation, something the Japanese will repeat, something they can't hide." A silence fell. Then Layton whispered, "Sir, what if we trick them into saying it?" Rochefort's eyes narrowed. He understood. A bait message, a deliberate leak, a gambit that could cost careers if wrong, yet could save thousands of lives if right. But if they tried it, if they went ahead with this insane plan, everything depended on the faint, nearly invisible characters typed by one woman with a broken ribbon. The next morning, Pearl Harbor woke under a humid gray sky, but inside Station Hypo, the air crackled like a live wire. Everyone knew what was about to happen was risky, career-ending risky. Yet it was the only way to confirm what Jane's faint, double-typed characters had revealed. Rochefort gathered his officers around the central table. Maps of the Pacific lay spread out like a giant puzzle that only one side understood. Japanese fleets moved in shadows. U.S. carriers were scrambling. Every incorrect assumption meant thousands of men sailing blindly into a trap. "We leaked the message today," Rochefort said, "and it must sound routine, harmless, something the Japanese would never doubt." The idea was simple, almost absurdly simple. Send a fake, unencrypted message from Midway. "Our freshwater system is failing. No codes, no encryption, no attempt to disguise it. Just a mundane logistical complaint, the type of message the Japanese would naturally intercept." If they repeated that detail in their own encrypted traffic, then AF, Jane's suspected location code, was unquestionably Midway. But everything rested on the assumption that the Japanese would actually mention it. And assumptions get men killed. Still, there was no other choice. At 10:58 a.m., the Midway station transmitted the bait, a clean, clear sentence drifting across the Pacific like a whisper. Rochefort stared at the clock. Layton paced the floor. Jane sat at her desk, hands trembling slightly, as if afraid the next incoming message might decide the entire war hours past. Nothing. No confirmation. No intercepted reply. No repeat of the fake detail. Some officers began to doubt the entire plan. Maybe the Japanese didn't hear it. Maybe they don't report freshwater issues. Maybe AF isn't Midway after all. Jane sat silent, but her eyes stayed locked on the receiver logs. She had seen Japanese communications spike before major operations. She recognized the pattern the way a pianist recognizes a familiar rhythm. And tonight something told her the response was coming. Then, just before midnight, a faint transmission hit Hypo's receivers, Japanese encryption. JN25B, tightly packed groups, regular cadence. Until suddenly, there it was. A single phrase buried deep inside the encoded text, a logistical update, a reference to AF. And then, like a spark in the dark, AF is short of water. The room exploded. Papers shot into the air. Officers yelled across the floor. Someone actually jumped onto a table. It was the clearest confirmation Hypo had received in months. AF equals Midway. No doubt, no debate, no hesitation. Rochefort slammed his palm on the table. "Send it upstairs, now! We have their target." Jane sat frozen, breath shaking. Her torn ribbon, her impossible-to-read characters, had led to the single message that cracked the Japanese plan wide open. But the victory wasn't theirs yet. Upstairs in Washington, many still didn't trust Hypo. They demanded fuller evidence, clearer patterns, more intercepts. Time was slipping away. The Japanese fleet was already approaching, and unless the U.S. positioned its carriers perfectly, the Pacific would fall. Rochefort turned to Jane. "We need every message cleaned, copied, and ready. You're our fastest. Don't stop for anything." She nodded. No hesitation, no fear. Because something inside her knew. The next 48 hours would decide not just the fate of Midway, but the entire balance of power in the Pacific. The morning of June 3rd broke with a thin gray light over Pearl Harbor, but inside Hypo, it felt like war had already begun. Jane arrived at her desk before dawn, clutching a fresh stack of typewriter ribbons. Each ribbon carried her fingerprints, sweat, and mistakes. The same mistakes that paradoxically had become the most valuable tool the U.S. Navy had in decrypting Japanese communications. Rochefort paced behind the rows of operators. His face was tight with focus, hands clasped behind his back. Around him the room hummed with the low whir of teleprinters and the occasional staccato clatter of keys. Every operator knew what was at stake. Every keystroke, every missed character, every tiny error might either give them the upper hand or doom the entire fleet. Jane began feeding intercepted Japanese messages into the decrypting machines. Her eyes flicked between the ribbons and the output, scanning for patterns that could confirm the enemy's plans. Each message was a maze of numbers and letters, but her experience, instinct, and uncanny memory allowed her to spot the slightest irregularities. By mid-morning, the first actionable intelligence emerged. Japanese carriers were on the move, their exact coordinates mapped out with precision. Jane's earlier error, the infamous faded ribbon, had created a chain reaction. Analysts could now triangulate positions with confidence. For the first time in weeks, Hypo had a near-perfect understanding of the enemy's formation. Rochefort called Leighton over, and they compared notes. "They're advancing faster than we expected," Leighton said, tapping the map. "But your team's work gives us a chance to intercept." Rochefort nodded, eyes hard. "We can't waste it. Notify Nimitz immediately. He needs to position the carriers before the Japanese arrive." Meanwhile, Jane continued her work, fingers flying across the keys, sweat beaded on her forehead. But she didn't pause. Each character she typed, each ribbon that rolled forward, brought clarity to the intelligence puzzle. The faintest errors from earlier transmissions now made sense, revealing a pattern no one else had noticed. The Japanese were committing to a risky advance, leaving Midway partially exposed. By late afternoon, the full picture had emerged. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were within striking distance, moving in tight formation. Hypo's intelligence confirmed their fuel status, aircraft readiness, and even minor logistical weaknesses. The U.S. Navy could now plan a precise counterstrike, catching the Japanese off guard. For Jane, the realization was surreal. A simple typing mistake months earlier, the fading ribbon, the misaligned characters, had contributed directly to this critical breakthrough. She had never imagined that a seemingly insignificant error could ripple into something so monumental. Rochefort addressed the room, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "Prepare the reports for Nimitz. Every detail counts. Our carriers, planes, and pilots will rely on this intelligence. History is about to be written by those who act decisively." As dusk fell, Hypo transmitted the final intelligence packets. Jane exhaled for the first time all day. Outside, the Pacific shimmered under the setting sun, unaware that the stage for one of the most decisive battles of World War II had been meticulously set, thanks in no small part to a woman who had turned a faded ribbon into a weapon more powerful than any battleship. The next day, the U.S. Navy would strike. And in just 5 hours, 4 Japanese carriers would vanish from the Pacific forever. June 4th dawned over the Pacific with a tense stillness that seemed almost unnatural. The U.S. carriers were in position, hidden from sight, while Jane and the team at Hypo watched the unfolding situation through the lens of decrypted intelligence. Every message, every coordinate, every snippet of information she had typed, corrected, and analyzed was now guiding the actions of thousands of sailors and pilots. The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders, but she had learned long ago that focus, not fear, determined outcomes. By mid-morning, the first American planes launched from the carriers, their engines cutting through the thin morning air as they raced toward the unsuspecting Japanese fleet. Jane followed every transmission, her fingers poised over the typewriter, updating coordinates, noting changes, confirming positions. The faded ribbon, once a source of frustration, had now become a symbol of precision. The minor errors it had caused had forced the team to double-check everything, creating a level of scrutiny that left no room for mistakes. The battle began with chaos. Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted, planes dove, and the ocean became a canvas of smoke, fire, and metal. Yet the intelligence Jane and her colleagues provided allowed U.S. pilots to strike with terrifying accuracy. Dive bombers found their targets almost effortlessly, guided by the decrypted positions she had helped determine within hours. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carriers were ablaze, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. The Japanese fleet, confident just days before, was now in disarray. News from the front filtered back to Hypo in fragments. Pilots reporting hits, ships sinking, enemy aircraft shot down. Jane read each line, heart pounding, realizing that the work she had done in secret, late nights, long hours, meticulous transcription, was directly responsible for the outcome. The mistake with the ribbon had unknowingly created a chain of verification steps that ensured no detail was overlooked. Every character she typed could be traced to the destruction of 4 enemy carriers. By late afternoon, the battle was effectively over. The Japanese carriers were destroyed, their air power shattered, and their plans to dominate the Pacific decisively halted. Jane sat back, exhausted, watching the final messages arrive. Hypo had done its job. The intelligence she had painstakingly decoded had turned the tide of history in mere hours. Yet outside Hypo, the world remained unaware of her contribution. No headlines proclaimed the woman behind the ribbon, the typist whose attention to detail had saved countless lives. Jane knew the reality of war. Heroes often went unrecognized, but their actions spoke louder than medals or fame. She smiled faintly, thinking of the ripple effect of small, meticulous work and how history sometimes depended on the quiet diligence of someone no one ever noticed. The faded ribbon had changed everything. A simple tool, once a source of error, had become the instrument of a historic victory. 4 Japanese carriers sunk in 5 hours. Thousands of lives altered, and a pivotal moment in World War II secured, and all because one woman had typed with focus, care, and determination, proving that even the smallest actions can have monumental consequences. History would remember the Battle of Midway. Few would remember the faded ribbon that made it possible.